In the stillness of dawn, a shadow slipped across the desert sand. Golden eyes gleamed from the brush, watching, waiting. A faint rumble of a purr vibrated in the silence, deep and steady. Each step carried the weight of memory, though no one could see it. A scar traced across the wild bobcat's flank, a mark of survival. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of something long forgotten. And the bobcat paused, as if the desert itself held its breath. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable animal stories. The desert morning was quiet, painted in muted shades of gold and lavender as the first light spilled across the Arizona grasslands. Ethan Walker adjusted the legs of his tripod with the deliberate care of a man who had spent decades in the field, waiting for moments that most people would never see. At 68, his body bore the marks of time, aching joints, sun-worn skin, and the soft stoop of years bent over cameras, but his spirit was still sharpened by the thrill of the wild. For Ethan, this land wasn't just scenery, it was history. He had been coming here for decades, long before retirement, long before loss had carved deeper lines into his face. Every fold of the mountains, every bend in the dry washes, was as familiar to him as the back of his weathered hands. He knew the way the morning sun crept slowly across the mesas, igniting them into flames of orange and red. He knew the call of the canyon wren that would echo in the stillness, the skitter of lizards racing between brittle bushes, and the swoop of hawks that ruled the skies above. This place, the grasslands just north of the Mexican border, was not just part of his portfolio as a wildlife photographer. It was part of his soul. It had comforted him when grief threatened to consume him after his wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years earlier. Out here, the silence wasn't empty, it was healing. That morning, Ethan wasn't expecting miracles. His goal was modest. Capture the light striking the ridge at dawn, one of those fleeting minutes where the desert became more than just earth and stone. He adjusted his camera, peered through the viewfinder, and inhaled deeply. The air smelled faintly of creosote, sharp and earthy after the previous night's brief sprinkle of rain. Everything felt still, balanced, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Then movement caught the corner of his eye. At first, he assumed it was a coyote or perhaps a jackrabbit. His years had trained him not to jerk or startle, only to let his gaze slide slowly toward the disturbance. That's when he saw it, emerging from a thicket of brittle bush, silent, fluid, and powerful. A bobcat. It was larger than most he'd encountered in his long career. Its golden coat shimmered in the sunlight, mottled with spots that broke up its outline perfectly against the dry earth. Tufted ears twitched like antennae, scanning the air, and its eyes, amber, sharp, alive, locked straight onto his. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He knew bobcats well enough to understand what should have happened next. They were elusive ghosts of the desert. At the slightest whiff of a human, they vanished, slipping into the scrub so silently you'd question whether you had seen them at all. Yet this one didn't vanish. It didn't crouch low in suspicion or bolt away into the safety of the brush. Instead, it began to walk toward him. Each step was deliberate, calm, as though the animal was not merely aware of Ethan's presence but intent on closing the distance. The sound of its paws was almost imperceptible against the dry soil, yet to Ethan, every movement thundered in his chest. His heart beat a steady, heavy rhythm that echoed in his ears. He froze, though not from fear. Fear had been tempered long ago by years in the wild, by standing still in the face of grizzlies, bison, and even alligators in swamps far from here. What rooted him to the spot now was something deeper, wonder, disbelief, and a strange, creeping familiarity that he couldn't yet place. 20 yards. The bobcat kept coming. Its eyes never wavered. Its gait was steady, but Ethan noticed something strange, a subtle unevenness, a slight widening of the right paw with every step. It was not a limp, but a memory of an old injury, carried forward in the animal's stride. Ethan's mind stirred, reaching for a connection buried in the vaults of time. 10 yards. The details grew sharper now, the individual whiskers catching the sun, the faint healed scar just above the cat's left eye, the deliberate way its head tilted ever so slightly as it regarded him. It was the kind of expression Ethan had seen before, not on a wild predator, but on something far more intimate, far more familiar. 5 yards. The bobcat stopped. The air between them seemed to hum with tension, not of danger, but of recognition. Its gaze softened, shifting from assessment to something gentler, something Ethan couldn't yet understand. His body screamed for him to raise his camera, to document the moment, to capture this once-in-a-lifetime encounter, but his hands refused. This was not a scene to record from behind glass. This was something else entirely. And then, the extraordinary happened. The bobcat stepped forward one final pace, closed the distance, and pressed its head against Ethan's shoulder. A deep, resonant purr vibrated through the air, through Ethan's bones, through every memory he had locked away. The desert around him blurred as the weight of years collapsed into a single, breathtaking realization. This wasn't just any bobcat. This was a face from his past, a bond long thought lost, a miracle walking on four paws back into his life. The rumbling purr against Ethan's shoulder was more than just a sound. It was a key, unlocking a door he hadn't opened in years. As the vibration coursed through him, memories surged forward with such force that his knees almost buckled. He staggered back a half step, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of recognition. This wasn't the first time he had met this creature. No, he had known him before, in a different form, smaller, weaker, and infinitely more fragile. 8 years earlier, the same Arizona grasslands had been alive with a story Ethan could never bring himself to publish. He had been tracking a Gila monster, a notoriously elusive reptile that had evaded his lens for decades. Hours had stretched into days, and patience was his only ally. But instead of the reptile he sought, the desert had delivered something entirely unexpected. Out of the brush had tumbled a bobcat kitten, barely the size of a loaf of bread, its oversized paws clumsy in the dust, its swagger far larger than its tiny frame could justify. Ethan remembered laughing softly under his breath, the sound muffled by the desert air, as the little creature marched right up to his camp as though it owned the land. The kitten was not alone. Within days, Ethan learned the family's rhythm. There was a strong, majestic mother he would come to call Queenie, regal in her watchfulness, always perched on a sunlit rock like a sentinel. Around her swirled a chaotic parade of kittens, each with a personality as vivid as any child. There was Scout, bold and daring, forever testing the boundaries. There was Lila, sly and quick-witted, whose sharp eyes always spotted prey first. There was Dash, the whirlwind, a streak of energy that never seemed to rest. And then, there was the smallest one, Jasper. Jasper was different. While his siblings tumbled, pounced, and wrestled with each other, he lagged behind. His steps were clumsy, his reflexes just a fraction slower. He was curious, endlessly so, but often found himself in scrapes his siblings avoided. He tripped over branches, missed leaps, and seemed to stumble into trouble more often than not. Yet he had something none of the others had, an affection for Ethan. Where the others kept a wary distance, Jasper often approached. He would linger near Ethan's tripod, curl against the warmth of his boots, and sometimes settle quietly beside him, purring in a way that seemed too deliberate for the wild. Ethan had never touched him, never dared cross that boundary, but the companionship of the tiny creature soothed the aching loneliness he carried like a shadow. Those days had been strange and beautiful. Ethan knew the unwritten rule of his profession: observe, never interfere. But observing Jasper stirred something deeper. The kitten's clumsy affection chipped away at the wall Ethan had built around himself since Margaret's death. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't alone in the world. And then came the storm. The desert skies could shift in an instant, and on that day, they turned from clear blue to a bruised, angry purple. Thunder rolled across the plains, and rain came down in violent sheets. In seconds, the dry arroyo near Ethan's camp transformed into a raging river of mud and debris. He remembered the panic, the frantic mules that pierced the storm. Queenie's cries were raw, primal, filled with a mother's anguish that transcended species. Jasper had fallen behind. Ethan saw him, struggling, flailing, swept away by the torrent. In that instant, the rulebook of wildlife photography disintegrated. There was no thought, no calculation, only instinct. He charged into the flood, icy water surging around his waist, threatening to knock him off his feet. The current tore at him, but he fought forward, eyes locked on the tiny spotted body tumbling in the current. He reached Jasper, scooping the limp kitten into his hands. The weight was terrifyingly light, lifeless. Ethan scrambled back to the bank, collapsing on the mud, his chest heaving. Jasper did not move. His tiny body was sodden, his chest frighteningly still. Ethan's heart thundered in terror. He acted without hesitation. Pressing 2 fingers gently against Jasper's ribs, he pushed rhythmically, willing the kitten's lungs to respond. He breathed tiny puffs of air into the small nose, praying, pleading. Seconds stretched like eternity. And then, miracle. Jasper coughed. Water sputtered from his mouth, and his chest rose with a ragged gasp. A shuddering cry followed, weak but alive. Ethan cradled him against his jacket, shielding him from the rain, tears mixing with the storm. For 2 days, Ethan became caretaker. He fed Jasper weak chicken broth, coaxing him to sip from his fingertips. He kept him warm against his pillow at night, waking often to ensure the kitten still breathed. Jasper grew stronger, purring again, curling into the crook of Ethan's arm with the blind trust of a child. It was, Ethan realized, one of the most profound connections of his life. When Jasper finally returned to Queenie and his siblings, Ethan had braced for rejection. Instead, the mother bobcat surprised him. She dropped a freshly caught lizard at his feet. A gift, a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. From that moment on, she watched him with something other than suspicion. Respect. Trust. That season passed quickly. One day, the grasslands fell quiet, and Ethan knew they were gone. The ache of their absence was sharp, but he carried the memory like a secret, untold chapter of his life. He never wrote about it, never published a single photograph from those days. It was too personal, too sacred. And now, as the adult bobcat pressed against him with that same uneven gait, that same tilt of the head, the flood of memory confirmed what his heart already knew. This was Jasper, grown, powerful, wild, and yet somehow, impossibly, still connected to him. Ethan's hand trembled as it hovered near the bobcat's thick fur, the desert silence pressing in around them. The purr reverberated through his bones, grounding him in the present even as memories tugged him backward. This wasn't just recognition, it was proof. Proof that the tiny, drenched kitten he had once pulled from death's grip had survived the wild, carried its lessons, and returned as something magnificent. Jasper lifted his head, his amber eyes steady, intelligent, and unafraid. The way he leaned into Ethan's touch told him everything. This was no accident of proximity, no curious animal stumbling into a human's camp. This was deliberate. This was a reunion. Slowly, carefully, Ethan allowed his hand to settle on Jasper's neck. The fur was coarse yet warm beneath his fingers, and the bobcat responded not with alarm, but with trust, pressing closer. A sound escaped Ethan's throat, a choked, broken laugh tangled with sobs. "It really is you," he whispered, voice cracked from years of silence. "You stubborn little survivor." The bond forged in that storm so many years ago had never faded. For Ethan, it had lived on as a bittersweet memory, a secret he carried when the nights grew lonely and the world felt too wide. For Jasper, it had taken form in something rarer, recognition across time and instinct. The wild was supposed to erase human contact, to burn away memory with survival's demands. Yet here he was, choosing not to vanish, but to stay. Ethan reached into his worn camera bag, movements slow and telegraphed. Jasper watched with unblinking calm, ears swiveling at distant sounds but body relaxed, as though certain Ethan meant no harm. His fingers brushed past lenses and spare batteries until they found the small vacuum-sealed pouch. Inside was something Ethan always carried, freeze-dried rabbit treats. It was a habit, a quiet ritual from his years in the field, small offerings, just in case, though he rarely used them. He tore the pouch open, the faint scent drifting on the warm air. Extending his open palm, he offered one toward Jasper. The bobcat leaned in, sniffed once, and then with surprising gentleness, took the treat. His rough tongue brushed Ethan's skin, and the act struck him with the weight of memory. This was how he had coaxed Jasper to eat when the kitten was too weak to feed himself. Tiny bites of food, patience, and trust. It was not hunger that made Jasper accept the treat now. It was something else. Ritual, memory, recognition. Ethan laughed again, the sound wet and unsteady. tears sliding freely down his weathered cheeks. "You gave me a scare all those years ago," he murmured. "And now you've come back just to prove I wasn't dreaming." What astonished him most was what happened next. Instead of prowling away after his prize, Jasper circled once and then settled at the base of Ethan's tripod. He tucked his paws beneath his chest, body curved in quiet repose, as though he intended to keep vigil. Ethan's heart swelled so powerfully it hurt. This was no pet awaiting a command, no domesticated animal lingering for food. This was a wild sentinel, choosing to remain. For nearly an hour, Ethan forgot the camera altogether. He sat cross-legged on the warm ground, his hat brim brushing occasionally against Jasper's fur. The bobcat's breathing was steady, his ears twitching to distant sounds, birds calling, the faint shuffle of a rodent in the brush. But his body remained anchored beside Ethan's. The silence between them was not emptiness but fullness, heavy with shared history, a bond that transcended language. Eventually, instinct tugged at Ethan's professional side. He reached slowly for his camera, careful not to disturb Jasper. This time, he did not aim at the horizon or at the faraway ridges drenched in light. He turned the lens toward the companion beside him. Through the viewfinder, he saw Jasper not as a subject, but as kin. He captured the way sunlight gilded the golden fur, the quiet dignity in his eyes, the faint twitch of his tail. But every time he lowered the camera, Ethan lingered, simply watching. He thought of the years lost between them, the uncertainty of whether Jasper had survived, and the miracle of this return. He realized that what bound them was not rescue alone, but resilience. Both had endured storms. Ethan the storm of grief, Jasper the storm of the wild. Both had emerged scarred but unbroken. A rustle came from the creosote nearby. Jasper's head lifted, body coiling like a spring, every muscle honed by the life of a predator. Ethan held his breath, certain the moment was over, that instinct would reclaim him and the desert would once again swallow Jasper whole. But then, after a long, tense pause, the bobcat relaxed. He lowered his head back onto his paws, a soft sigh escaping him, and chose to stay. Ethan understood then. This was not dependence. Jasper had no need of him for survival. This was a choice. A wild heart, unchained and untamed, had decided to share its solitude for a few precious hours with the one human it trusted. It was a bond not written in rules or roles, but in something far older: gratitude, memory, and love. Ethan exhaled slowly, the ache of loneliness that had haunted him for years lifting, replaced by a warmth that filled every corner of his being. He no longer felt like a man abandoned to silence. He felt seen, chosen, remembered. This was what survival meant. Not just enduring storms, but carrying forward the connections forged within them. And as the sun rose higher over the desert, gilding the world in heat and brilliance, Ethan knew one truth with absolute clarity. Jasper's return was not chance. It was destiny. The desert sun climbed higher, its heat rippling across the sand, the kind of warmth that pressed down like a weight. Ethan sat still beside Jasper, unwilling to move, unwilling to break the fragile magic of the moment. Every second felt like a gift, every breath of the bobcat beside him a miracle that rewrote the years of solitude he had endured. But as the morning stretched toward noon, Jasper stirred. He rose in a single fluid motion, the power of the wild coursing through his long muscles, reminding Ethan that this creature belonged to no one. Ethan's heart clenched even before Jasper turned his amber eyes toward him, gaze steady and direct. He knew what was coming. The wild did not linger. It always moved forward. Jasper stepped close, brushing his head gently against Ethan's shin. The gesture was not tentative, but certain, a deliberate farewell marked not in sound but in touch. Ethan froze, feeling the weight of that moment, because it was more than instinct. It was memory, acknowledgement, and gratitude bound together. He reached down, letting his hand rest briefly on the bobcat's neck, committing the feel of that warm, living presence to memory. No words were spoken. None were needed. Then, as if guided by the wind itself, Jasper turned. He padded silently toward the brittle brush at the edge of the clearing. His spotted coat blended with the desert, his form already dissolving into shadow and dust. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as Jasper slipped between branches, each step erasing him further until he was gone. vanished as completely as if he had never been. The silence that followed was profound, yet not empty. Ethan sat motionless for a long time, the air still humming with Jasper's absence. He could almost feel the echo of the bobcat's purr against his chest, a phantom warmth pressed into his memory. For the first time in years, he felt the paradox of solitude. He was alone, but not lonely. Slowly, deliberately, Ethan packed his camera. His hands no longer shook with grief or hesitation, but moved with quiet certainty. Each lens, each card, was tucked away not as tools of his profession, but as relics of a story that had chosen him. The story of Jasper was not one of distance or documentary objectivity. It was a story of bond, of defying the wild's unwritten law, of love echoing across years and storms. When he climbed into his old truck, he glanced at the passenger seat where his camera bag rested. For decades, it had carried glimpses of the wild, shots of eagles in flight, deer at dawn, storms rolling over canyons. But now, for the first time, it carried something more than images. It carried proof of the bond he had once dared to form, the bond that had returned to him in the most impossible way. As he started the engine and the tires crunched against gravel, Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. The hollow ache in his chest, the companion of his later life, had been filled with a purr, with amber eyes, with a wild heart that had chosen to remember him. He realized something startling in its simplicity. He had not saved Jasper alone all those years ago. Jasper had saved him too, in ways he had only now come to understand. The road stretched ahead, long and winding through the desert. The horizon shimmered in the heat, but Ethan's vision was clear. Behind him lay silence, loss, and loneliness. Ahead of him lay peace. He spoke aloud, voice steady, though no one sat beside him to hear. "Thank you, Jasper, for everything." And though the desert gave no reply, Ethan felt the truth settle within him. This was not an ending, but a continuation, proof that bonds, once forged in survival and love, did not break with time or distance. They lived on, carried in memory, in heart, in every step forward. The man drove on, his eyes dry now, his soul quiet. Somewhere beyond the ridges, a bobcat prowled free, wild and strong. And in the quiet corners of Ethan's being, he knew their story would never leave him. It was the greatest story he had ever lived. Not about animals and cameras, not about documentation, but about recognition, choice, and love. For Ethan, that was enough. It was more than enough.